I knew the bruise had bloomed into something ugly the moment the bathroom light hit it. Under my cheekbone, the purple had a stubborn shine, like it had its own pulse. I layered concealer, tapped powder, smiled at my reflection the way I smiled at Ellie when she asked if monsters were real. By the time I pushed through the glass doors of Luce, the smile was gone. The hostess stand glowed like a jewelry case, and I could already feel my manager's eyes on my face. Marcus didn't waste breath on hello. He caught my elbow as I slipped my apron on, his grip firm but not quite touching skin, like he was afraid of catching whatever I carried. In his gaze, I saw the quick math every boss does: staff shortage, big spenders, and a server who'd take the blame if anything went wrong. His mouth formed late again. Claire. And I felt the sting of my name like a tag on a uniform. His eyes flicked to the bruise in a way so fast it almost looked like kindness. Then the order came, quick and final. Val was out sick, and I was taking the private dining room rotation tonight. My stomach tightened. The private room meant crisp bills tucked under plates, and men who didn't hear the word no unless it came from someone wearing a watch worth my monthly rent. It also meant being alone behind a closed door, serving people who loved privacy for reasons that never felt innocent. I nodded anyway, because nodding was easier than explaining that my babysitter charged extra when I was late, that my landlord didn't care about excuses, and that Ellie's school wanted the field trip fee by Friday. I kept my voice low, apologetic, and useless, the way I'd trained it to be. On the subway ride in, Ellie's tiny handprint was still smeared on my phone screen from when she'd stolen it to take pictures of her cereal. I'd laughed then, too loud, because laughing covered the quiet parts. The quiet parts were the bruise, the aching tired in my bones, and the promise I kept making to myself that things would get better once I just got through this week. Luce hummed the way expensive places always do, like money had its own frequency. Candlelight softened the faces of people who never worried about overdraft fees. Glasses chimed. Steak hit hot plates with a hiss. Truffle and citrus and perfume braided together until it was hard to tell what belonged to food and what belonged to power. I moved between tables like I was built for slipping through cracks. I smiled when I had to, kept my shoulders small, kept my eyes down. Invisible was my safest setting. Invisible meant no questions about the bruise. Invisible meant no one noticing how my hands shook when a man laughed too close behind me. Around 9, a ripple ran through the room. It wasn't loud. It was more like the air changing pressure before rain. Servers straightened. Marcus's posture snapped to attention. Even the sommelier, who treated everyone like a minor inconvenience, stopped mid-step as if he'd been paused. I felt it in my skin first, that old instinct that told me when to leave a party, when to cross the street, when to lower my voice. The fine hairs at my neck rose. My grip slipped on a water glass and I caught it at the last second, knuckles whitening. When I looked toward the private dining hall, I didn't see a scene. I saw a gravity well. A man sat at the far end of the long table, suit black enough to swallow light, tie a deep wine red, hands resting still, as if motion was optional. 2 men stood behind him, not eating, not talking, scanning the room with the calm of people who expected trouble and didn't fear it. I didn't need anyone to tell me his name for my body to understand it. Dominic Vale. The syllables came to me the way headlines come when you live in a city long enough. The kind of man who didn't reserve, didn't request, didn't wait. The kind of man the staff treated like weather. Something you adjusted to because you couldn't stop it. A server I barely knew brushed past me, whispering information under her breath to another, and I caught pieces. Finance, docs, lawsuits that disappeared, men who apologized without being asked. Marcus, who barked orders at us like we were furniture, suddenly spoke in a softer tone to the kitchen, like the walls might report him. The owner of Luce, Mr. Bell, floated through the dining room every night with a practiced grin, shaking hands with donors and influencers. Tonight, he stayed in his office. Nobody told me that. I knew it because the door never opened, and because Marcus kept glancing that way like he was waiting for permission to breathe. My section needed refills, dessert forks, a birthday candle, but my attention kept snagging on the private hall like a thread on a nail. Every time I passed, one of the guards' eyes tracked me with zero expression. I told myself it was nothing. I'd been telling myself that for months. Nothing, 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 until nothing turned into bruises and apologies and another Monday. Then, as I set down a tray at table 12, I felt the weight of a stare like a hand at my throat. I looked up without meaning to. Dominic Vale had turned his head, just slightly, and his gaze found my cheekbone with unsettling precision. It wasn't pity. It wasn't curiosity. It was recognition. like he'd spotted a crack in glass and decided it mattered. For a second, I saw Ellie's sleepy forehead and the rent notice on my fridge, and I understood how fast one man's attention could rearrange a life. Heat climbed my neck, dread settled in my stomach, and somewhere under that, against all logic, relief flickered, small and dangerous, because someone had finally seen what everyone else pretended not to. I swallowed, smoothed my apron, and kept walking, knowing the night had already changed, knowing the next step would be his, not mine. His gaze stayed on me long after I turned away, and that was the problem. I could keep moving, keep balancing plates, keep smiling like nothing hurt, but my skin knew I'd been noticed. The dining room felt tighter, like the chandeliers had lowered an inch. Every time I passed the private hall, I felt the pull of it, a quiet demand. Marcus avoided my eyes. Servers stopped whispering when I walked by, which told me I'd become part of whatever story they were telling themselves about Dominic Vale. Near midnight, the kitchen door swung open and Marcus caught my sleeve, his face pale under the heat lamps. He didn't scold this time. He just angled his head toward the private room, the way people point at a storm on the horizon. I understood without being told. I was needed. My pulse hammered as I crossed the carpeted corridor. The guards outside the door barely moved, but the room behind them felt alive, like it had a heartbeat of its own. Dominic sat alone at a table meant for a dozen, a glass of amber liquor untouched beside his hand. Up close, he was worse. Not because he looked cruel, but because he looked certain. The scar at his brow made him seem carved instead of born. He didn't ask if I was afraid. He let me feel it. His eyes lifted to my cheekbone, and the bruise might as well have been a confession written in ink. The question he pressed into the silence was simple, almost clinical, and it made my throat close. I gave him the lie that always kept the peace, the one I'd practiced in mirrors and on subway platforms. I said it was an accident, a clumsy moment, anything but the truth. He watched me the way a judge watches a witness, and I could tell he didn't believe a word. I felt anger spark, sharp and humiliating, not at him, but at the whole room that had looked away all night. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When he indicated the chair across from him, my body obeyed before my pride could argue. He asked my name and what time I finished, and the way he asked felt less like curiosity and more like inventory. I told myself to stand, to leave, to remember that men with power rarely give anything for free. Still, when he leaned forward, the scent of expensive cologne and winter air, I found myself listening like a starving person offered bread. He spoke about safety the way other people talk about weather, as if it was something he could control with a gesture. Then he reached into his jacket and slid a card toward me. It was thick paper, clean edges, no logo, no name, only a phone number in black ink, neat as a signature. My fingers tingled when I touched it, like I'd grabbed a live wire. I hated that a part of me wanted to keep it. I hated even more that another part of me wanted to call it immediately, to ask him to say what everyone else refused to say out loud. He stood, and I understood the meeting was over. When I left the private room, the corridor felt colder, like I'd stepped out of a different climate. The rest of my shift blurred. I refilled wine I couldn't pronounce, carried plates that cost more than my weekly groceries, and kept feeling the card against my thigh through the apron pocket. Around 2 a.m., Marcus stopped me at the coat rack with an expression that tried to be casual and failed. A black car was waiting, he implied, and it wasn't optional. Outside, the curb gleamed with rain. A Mercedes idled like a patient animal. The driver opened the door with a practiced respect that made my skin crawl. Dominic wasn't in the back seat, and the relief I felt annoyed me. The leather smelled new, and underneath it I caught the same cologne, faint but present, like a reminder. I gave my address and watched the city slide by in muted reflections. I called Ryan the second the car merged onto the avenue, because my brother lived on the edge of my panic and I needed him tethered to me. His voice came tight and urgent, and before I could explain anything, I heard his warning fold my name into fear. He already knew Dominic Vale. That was the moment my stomach dropped. I stared at the card in my palm, then at the driver's calm silhouette, and I felt the world widen into something I hadn't agreed to. Ryan's words rushed, protective and suspicious, and all I could catch was that I needed to stay away, that attention from a man like Dominic was never safe, that people disappeared when they became useful. I tried to ask how he knew, tried to demand answers, and then the call turned into dead air. No ring, no beep, just silence. When the car stopped in front of my building, the hallway light was out again. I climbed the stairs with my phone flashlight, expecting Ryan's footsteps, his irritated lecture, his usual presence. But when I unlocked the door, the apartment greeted me with a stillness so complete it felt staged, like someone had taken the sound away on purpose. Silence met me before the lock clicked. Our apartment usually held Ryan's footprints and sound. A TV murmuring, keys clinking into the bowl, his heavy steps in the hallway. Tonight there was nothing but the refrigerator's tired buzz and my own breathing. I stood with my hand on the door, listening, waiting for him to appear, and demand an explanation for the black car that had delivered me. Ellie was safe at Grandma June's place in Queens. June had insisted on keeping her overnight because my shift ran late. I'd kissed Ellie's forehead before leaving, promised I'd be back before breakfast, and now that promise tugged at me like a rope. If something was wrong here, I couldn't let it reach them. I stepped inside without turning on the lamp. The living room looked paused. No hoodie draped over the chair. No snack wrapper on the coffee table. The bowl by the entry was empty, and the emptiness felt loud. Ryan's keys weren't there. I tried to breathe through the first spike of panic. He could be out. He could be annoyed and making a point. He could be asleep. My mind threw excuses at the dark the way I threw extra napkins into my apron, just in case. Then I noticed what else was missing. The hook by the door held nothing. Ryan's jacket was gone. So were his work boots. The dusty outline where they normally sat stared back at me like proof. I called his name, softer than I meant to, and the apartment swallowed it. No answer. No movement. My stomach tightened. His bedroom door was cracked open. Ryan never left it that way. I pushed it wider with 2 fingers, as if I could keep distance from what I might find. The room was wrong in a different way. Drawers hung open. Clothes were half folded, half dumped. His little toolbox sat on the bed, lid flipped back, sockets scattered. The blinds were crooked, and the air carried a faint smell of oil and something sharp, like metal rubbed too hard. His phone lay face down on the comforter. Ryan guarded that phone like it was his second wallet. He used it for everything. Shift changes, ride shares, late-night texts to make sure I got home safe. Seeing it abandoned hit me harder than the open drawers. I picked it up with shaking fingers. The battery was almost dead. No new messages, no missed calls that explained anything. And then I saw it. On his pillow sat a white card, perfectly placed, as if someone had measured the distance from the seam. Thick paper, clean edges, 1 phone number, no name, no company, no explanation. My own card was still in my pocket. I pulled it out, held them side by side, and felt my skin go cold. Same number, same ink, same blankness. This wasn't coincidence. It wasn't fate. It was someone letting me know they'd been here, in Ryan's room, close enough to touch the place where he slept. I backed out and locked the front door again, even though it was already locked. I checked the chain. I checked the window latches. I moved through the apartment like I could seal fear out with deadbolts. I called Ryan's friends from the shop. One went straight to voicemail. Another answered with a voice that sounded careful, like each word had a cost. I could hear hesitation, the kind that comes from looking over your shoulder. He said he hadn't seen Ryan since earlier, and ended the call fast, leaving me with a dial tone that felt accusing. I tried one more number, then another. The pattern stayed the same. Vague answers, too much silence, a sudden hurry to get off the phone. No one sounded surprised Ryan was missing. They sounded scared to admit they knew. Hours slipped by. I paced the narrow hallway until my legs ached. I made coffee I didn't drink. Outside, the city kept moving, unbothered by my crisis. Sirens rose and faded. A garbage truck rumbled past. My phone screen lit my hands blue as I refreshed messages that never arrived. By the time pale light crept through the blinds, it was around 6 a.m. The bruise on my cheek looked darker in daylight, like it belonged to someone else's face. I thought of Ellie waking up in Queens, asking for Uncle Ryan, and Grandma June trying to answer without scaring her. I couldn't let this stretch into a day. Time was already stealing him. The card waited on the kitchen table like a dare. Calling that number felt like stepping off a cliff and hoping the fall ended in water, not rock. I hated that my body reacted to the idea of help like it was a forgotten language. I dialed before I could talk myself out of it. Someone picked up on the first ring. The voice sounded prepared, like my call was just a checkmark. Before I could say who I was, my name came back to me, and then my address. Spoken like a fact, my stomach dropped. I demanded Ryan, and I was told he was alive and that I needed to be ready because a car was already pulling in. The line went dead. Minutes later, a black Mercedes waited outside. I climbed in and found Dominic Vale inside, calm, waiting. Dominic sat beside me as if the back seat belonged to him, knees angled slightly toward mine, hands still, expression unreadable. Outside the window, Manhattan lights smeared into gold streaks on wet pavement, and I felt like I was watching someone else's life. My phone lay cold in my palm, the dead call to Ryan replaying in my head. I wanted to demand answers, to claw my way back to normal, but my throat kept tightening. Dominic's calm made my panic louder, and the card in my pocket felt heavier than metal. I counted breaths, wondering who owned my next. The car left the city behind and climbed into darker roads where trees closed over the sky. At an iron gate, cameras tracked us and a guard waved us through without checking Dominic's face. The estate sat back from the road like a secret with perfect landscaping, stone walls, and quiet lights. Everything looked peaceful, which somehow scared me more. Peace meant planning. Peace meant control. The driveway curved past a fountain and ended at broad steps. When I stepped out, the air smelled like pine and expensive soap, clean enough to feel unreal. I held back like a shield. Inside, the house was warm and silent, the kind of silence you pay for, not the kind you inherit in a thin apartment. A woman in black led me through halls with art on the walls and doors that closed softly, like they were trained. Dominic guided me to a sunlit room where a table was set with coffee, fruit, and bread that still steamed. My stomach cramped with hunger, but my pride argued that eating here made me complicit. I sat anyway because my knees were trembling. Luxury pressed around me, velvet on the outside, bars underneath for now. Dominic watched me wrap my hands around the mug, as if warmth was evidence. His eyes kept returning to my cheekbone, and I felt both exposed and oddly validated. He didn't lecture. He simply laid out facts, the way weather reports lay out storms. Ryan, he implied, had been noticed in places a mechanic shouldn't matter. A name landed between us that changed the air: Carter Knox. Dominic described him as a rival who bought loyalty with cash and fear. He said Ryan had helped Knox map Dominic's routines, vehicles, and weak points. Hearing it, I tasted betrayal like copper. A side door opened, and two men guided Ryan in, not carrying him, but steadying him like his balance had been borrowed. His face was bruised in places I couldn't ignore, and one eye looked puffy, but he was upright, breathing, alive. Relief hit so hard it turned into anger. I rushed close, then stopped, because touching him made everything real. Ryan's gaze met mine and slid away, shame written all over him. Dominic stayed seated, calm, letting the moment belong to us. I could hear my heartbeat and the soft clink of a spoon against china in that room. Ryan's story spilled out in fragments, and I stitched it together from his tone and the way he flinched at certain details. It started at the shop with a fancy car and a customer who talked like he owned the street. Ryan was offered cash for simple upgrades, then asked to add tracking devices, then to hide tiny microphones where no one would find them. He told himself it was temporary, a shortcut, a way to get ahead. Knox's people praised his skill, paid him fast, and kept raising the stakes until he was placing surveillance on Dominic's world quietly. Then the why surfaced, and it cracked me open. Ryan wasn't greedy. He was drowning. He talked about daycare bills that came due like clockwork and rent that climbed every year. He talked about Ellie growing out of shoes faster than we could replace them. He talked about Derek's shadow, the way I kept pretending I could manage it, the way he felt like a failure watching me shrink. Dirty money looked like rescue when you're tired enough. Ryan believed he could buy us distance, a safer neighborhood, a new start. Hearing that, I felt love and fury collide hard. Dominic's explanation was spare, but it carried a blade. In his world, betrayal usually ended in a way that left no loose ends. The fact Ryan was sitting at this table meant Dominic had decided on something else, and that decision wasn't charity. He made it clear that bugs had been found, patterns traced, and that people under his protection could have died because of the information Ryan passed along. Then he added the detail that rewrote my memory. This hadn't happened once. Ryan had been doing it for 6 months, which explained every late night and every unexplained envelope. Ryan swallowed, and I saw the fear he'd hidden from me for months. I wanted to demand my brother back without conditions, but my mind kept jumping to Ellie asleep in Queens and to the bruise that started this chain. Dominic's attention settled on me with precision, and I understood he wasn't asking for permission, only offering a path. He explained there was a way forward that could keep Ryan breathing and keep me protected, but it would come with terms we couldn't ignore. He called it a proposition that saved everyone. I felt my autonomy sliding away from me. Dominic didn't raise his voice when he finally laid out the proposition. He didn't need to. The whole house seemed to lean in, even the sunlight on the table, even the quiet staff who kept pretending not to listen. He spoke in short sentences, like he was tightening bolts. Ryan would live. Ryan would keep his hands, his lungs, his future. But Ryan would no longer belong to the street corner world that had bought him. He would work exclusively for Dominic, in a garage and security division Ryan had never known existed, fixing cars and fixing mistakes, hunting for trackers instead of planting them. I heard it like a verdict, and a rescue at the same time. Ryan's shoulders sagged with relief, then stiffened, because relief in that room came with a chain attached. My brother looked at me once, apologizing without words. My mouth went dry. Then Dominic's focus shifted to me, not as a courtesy, but as the other half of the deal. My protection, he implied, would be the lock on Ryan's loyalty. If Ryan tried to run back to Knox, if he tried to play both sides again, I would be the consequence. Not harmed, not threatened out loud, just kept close, watched, moved like a piece on a board. The calm way he framed it made my stomach turn. Anger rose so fast it almost made me dizzy. I wanted to stand, to snatch my child and my brother and sprint back to our messy little life, even if it meant fear. I wasn't collateral. I wasn't a signature on a contract. I was a mother who packed lunches and balanced rent and kissed bad dreams out of Ellie's hair. I forced my hands flat on the table so no one would see them shake. But survival has its own math. Ellie's safety lived on the other side of this man's patience. Ryan's life sat on the other side of his mercy. I could say no and pretend my pride was armor, or I could accept the truth that Dominic held every lever in the room and Knox was already reaching for mine. So I negotiated, because bargaining was the only way to keep my spine. I made it clear, in the way I held Dominic's gaze, that my daughter and my grandmother were not afterthoughts. If I was to be protected, they were included in the plan. Ellie stayed with Grandma June by choice. Not because fear chased us around the city. June got a phone number that would be answered. She got a driver if she needed one. Ellie's school knew who could pick her up. My life didn't get split into compartments that a rival could exploit. Then I asked for the one thing that still felt like mine, my job at Luce. Not because it paid well, but because it was the only part of my identity I had chosen without someone pushing me into it. I told myself Dominic would laugh, or deny it with that quiet finality. Instead, he listened. His expression barely changed, but the air shifted. It was the first time I felt a line in him that wasn't just control. He valued something in me that wasn't softness. He valued resistance that had a reason. He agreed, but his agreement came with structure. A driver, a shadow of security, rules I would learn the hard way if I broke them. It wasn't freedom. It was a corner of autonomy carved out inside a fortress. Ryan exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for months. I should have felt relief. I did, for a second, until Dominic's attention returned to my cheekbone with surgical precision. He asked for Derek's full name and where he could be found. The request didn't sound like revenge. It sounded like scheduling. My skin went cold. I thought of Derek's apologies that always arrived wrapped in sweetness, and the way my bruises had become my private calendar. I wanted to say it didn't matter anymore, that I could handle it, that naming him would make me as dangerous as the men I feared. And then I realized Dominic already knew. He knew my life well enough to buy clothes in my size. He knew my address before I spoke it. He had pulled Ryan out of my apartment without leaving fingerprints. This question wasn't about information. It was about permission. He wanted me to open the door myself, to choose a line I could never uncross. My throat tightened. Ellie's face rose in my mind, sleepy and trusting. Ryan's swollen eye reminded me what happens when you wait for monsters to get bored. I said Derek Rousseau. And I added the detail that made it real. He worked nights at a shipping warehouse in Red Hook, the kind with loading docks and no windows. Dominic nodded once, calm as ever, and the room somehow got colder around my words. In that nod, I felt the future click into place, and I knew Derek was already closer than I ever imagined, waiting. The summons came less than an hour after I said Derek Rousseau's name. A housekeeper guided me down a corridor that smelled of lemon polish and rain-soaked wool. My legs wanted to stop, but my mind kept moving ahead, replaying Dominic's still nod, the way it cooled the room. I pressed my fingertips together to steady them and told myself to breathe like Ellie was watching. At the end of the hall, a heavy door waited. Beyond it, I felt consequence, fast and certain, catching up to my words. I stepped anyway, because hesitation had never saved anyone I loved. The study looked like old money and new surveillance had raised a child together. Leather-bound books lined the walls, but tiny cameras hid in the corners like insects. A fireplace glowed without crackling. All heat, no mess. 2 guards stood near the window, not blocking it, just reminding me that escape was a fantasy. Dominic was behind a wide desk, sleeves rolled, posture relaxed, eyes sharper than the brass lamp on the blotter. The air tasted of a coffee and cedar. This wasn't a room for talking. It was a room for decisions. Whatever came next would reach Ellie, too, eventually. Dominic gestured subtly, and my attention dropped to the floor beside the desk. Derek was there, kneeling with his wrists bound behind him. Hair mussed, face pale under the desk light. He looked smaller than my memory. Not because he'd changed, but because power had shifted away from him. The man who once filled doorways with his anger now avoided my eyes like a child caught stealing. My bruise tingled as if it recognized him. I didn't feel triumph. I felt nausea because the world had flipped overnight, and I didn't trust it. Yesterday I hid. Today he pleaded silently. For a second my mind ran to revenge, the hot fantasy of him finally fearing what I'd feared. Then Ellie's face interrupted it, soft and trusting, and I understood what I actually wanted. An ending, not a scene. Not a story I'd have to explain later. An ending where I could walk my daughter to school without scanning shadows. Dominic watched me the way he had watched my bruise, reading what I wouldn't say. I sensed he was offering me a choice. Not kindness, but ownership of the outcome. My hands shook, but my thoughts stayed sharp, practical, and protective. I looked at Derek and felt how tired I was of carrying him in my life, like a stain I couldn't scrub out. I didn't want his pain. I wanted his absence. So I demanded, in my own head and in the set of my shoulders, that he vanish. No calls, no apologies, no waiting outside Grandma June's building, no showing up near Ellie's school. And beyond me, he would never put his hands on another woman again. If he tried, I wanted the promise of consequences to follow him like a shadow he couldn't outrun. That was my mercy. Dominic didn't smile. He didn't praise me. He simply absorbed my conditions, the way a man absorbs a map before a journey. His eyes held something close to approval, not for suffering, but for limits. The guards shifted, subtle as a tide, and I understood my words had become instructions. Derek's breathing turned ragged, and I refused to look away this time. Dominic's restraint was the most frightening part, because it meant he didn't act from impulse. He acted from principle, and he expected others to do the same. In that I saw a code, and it steadied me slightly. When they pulled Derek up, I felt my knees threaten to fold, not from pity, but from the release of pressure I'd carried for too long. My bruise throbbed, then faded into the background like a memory losing color. I hated that I needed Dominic's world to make Derek small. I hated that it worked. Dominic stepped closer, not touching, giving me space to breathe, and that choice mattered. I was still afraid of him, but my fear had changed shape. It was less about what he might do to me and more about what he could do for me. I expected the moment to end there, clean and final, but Dominic's attention shifted past me toward a tablet on his desk that buzzed softly. He listened to an update from someone in the hall, and the temperature dropped again. Carter Knox, he explained in that same measured tone, had started asking questions in the city. Not about Ryan anymore. About me. About where I worked, where Ellie spent her days, who watched my building. Hearing my life described like a file made my stomach roll. Derek was a bruise, Knox was an infection, and infections spread. Even in daylight, they escorted Derek away, and the study felt emptier, like it had exhaled. I realized my hands were still shaking, and I forced them into my lap, thinking of Ellie and Grandma June. Dominic didn't press me for gratitude. He watched me as if measuring my boundaries, then offered a simple next step. Rest, eat, see Ryan again. I nodded because my body finally understood it was safe to feel tired. But safety wasn't a finish line. It was a moving target, and Knox had aimed at me. I followed Dominic out, unsure whether to fear him or trust him. After they led Derek out, my body didn't celebrate. It just kept vibrating, like it didn't trust the quiet. I returned to the guest suite Dominic had assigned me, and closed the door softly. Clean linen and faint garden scent filled the room. Outside the window, the Hudson Valley looked gentle. All fog and tree lines, but the property was stitched with cameras and men who never leaned. I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to understand what I'd chosen. Mercy sounded clean in other people's stories. In my mouth it tasted bitter, like coffee left too long. I kept seeing Derek's eyes when he realized he didn't own the room anymore. I told myself I chose boundaries, not forgiveness. Still, my hands shook as if my nervous system didn't believe me. Somewhere in Queens, Grandma June would be waking Ellie, pouring cereal, pretending the world was simple. I clung to that image, because my own world felt newly owned. Later, a housekeeper guided me downstairs to a smaller dining room off the kitchen. The space felt almost normal. One candle, 2 plates, a pot of soup that smelled like rosemary. Dominic was already there, jacket off, sleeves rolled, looking like a man who could sign orders and also ladle broth without thinking. 2 guards stood in the hallway beyond the archway, far enough to pretend privacy, close enough to erase it. Dominic didn't push me to talk about Derek. He didn't ask for gratitude. He simply made sure I ate, the way you make sure someone comes back into their body after shock. When I hesitated, he waited. He passed me a napkin, then a small jar of cream with a plain label, the same practical care he'd offered that first night at Luce. The bruise on my cheek was fading, but I still felt it inside my thoughts. His attention touched it once, then moved away, as if he refused to let pain be my whole identity. As we ate, I learned Dominic's softness wasn't sweet. It was disciplined. He spoke about his late mother the way people speak about an anchor, something that keeps you from drifting into uglier water. She'd grown up around men who mistook power for permission, and she'd taught him that a man's worth shows in how he treats the person who can't fight back. Losing her had hardened his lines. There were things he would do to protect what was his, but there were also things he would not do, even if it made him weaker in other men's eyes. Women, in his world, were not decorations and not collateral. The words hit me because they echoed my own fury from breakfast. I found myself telling him about the life I'd paused before Ellie. I'd studied art history once, back when I believed I'd have time for museums and quiet rooms and questions that didn't involve survival. I loved how a painting could hold a whole century inside a rectangle, how brushstrokes stayed human even when the subject was holy. On days off, I used to wander the Met and stand too long in front of portraits, staring at women who looked calm while their lives burned behind their eyes. Then my parents died, then Ellie came, then rent and daycare and Derek, and that part of me went quiet, like I'd packed it in a box and labeled it later. Dominic listened like it mattered. Not like a rich man collecting trivia, but like a man taking inventory of what I'd lost. He told me his foundation managed an art collection that moved between galleries and private loans, and that he needed someone who understood both the work and the people around it. Someone to coordinate acquisitions, track provenance, help plan small exhibits, and keep details clean. He framed it as a choice, not a command, and I almost didn't recognize the feeling of being offered a door instead of a cage. The twist wasn't the offer. The twist was the way it made my chest ache. I expected Dominic to buy me things the way powerful men buy silence. Instead, he was offering me a path back to myself, the version of me who knew the difference between Caravaggio's darkness and my own. For a moment, I saw Ellie in a museum coat, holding my hand, asking questions about colors instead of hiding from shouting. Hope scared me more than fear, because hope made me careless. When dinner ended, Dominic walked me partway back toward the guest wing. Not touching, just close enough that I could feel heat from him. The house stayed quiet around us, guards whispering into earpieces, the world outside still turning with Carter Knox somewhere in it. Dominic said the apartment in the city would be ready soon, safer, closer to Ellie and June, with protection built into the walls. I nodded, but my mind caught on one thought. If I step into that beautiful cage, will I still know where the door is, or will I stop wanting to leave? The new apartment key was heavier than it needed to be, a metal promise pressed into my palm by a driver. Brooklyn Heights looked like a postcard when we pulled up, brownstones and a river breeze that smelled cleaner than our old block. The building's lobby had soft lighting and a quiet elevator hum, and for a second I forgot to brace for sirens. Then I noticed the camera dome above the mailboxes and the man in a suit pretending to scroll his phone while his eyes tracked us. Safety, Dominic style, always came with witnesses. Ellie skipped ahead, backpack bouncing, as if we were checking into a hotel. Grandma June followed slower with groceries, muttering that a place this quiet had to be haunted by rich people's regrets. I laughed, and the sound surprised me. Inside, the apartment opened into bright windows and pale wood floors, fresh paint and new sheets, and a kitchen that didn't smell like old grease. Ellie ran her fingers over the couch and announced it felt like a cloud. I watched her face soften, and joy hit me so hard it came with grief, because she deserved this comfort long before a dangerous man decided we could have it. Dominic's people had stocked the fridge with fruit, yogurt, and little cartons of milk that Ellie loved. June inspected the cabinets, found a nightlight already plugged in, and gave me a look that said someone had planned our needs like a checklist. The front door had 2 locks and a keypad. The hallway outside was quiet, but not empty. I could feel presence the way you feel pressure change before rain. A man named Paulo introduced himself as the one who would be nearby, not inside, unless I asked. Even his politeness felt like a rule. Ryan visited the next afternoon, moving stiffly but trying to stand tall. His bruises were fading, but the apology in his eyes stayed fresh. He told June he'd start at Dominic's garage unit in a few days, and she answered with a prayer under her breath and a warning in her tone that she'd skin him alive if he ever gambled with my life again. I didn't know how to forgive him yet. I loved him, and I was angry, and those two feelings kept crashing into each other. When he looked at Ellie playing with the new crayons June had bought, I saw exactly why he'd taken Knox's money. It didn't make it right. It just made it human. On my first shift back at Roma, the driver arrived early and waited at the curb like I was important. Paulo stayed a few steps behind me, dressed like a businessman, watching reflections in windows instead of watching me. I walked through the restaurant doors with my chin up, but my cheeks burned anyway. Marcus stared at the car keys in my hand, then at my face, then pretended he didn't notice either. The other servers whispered with their eyes. I took orders and carried plates and tried to keep my voice steady, like my world hadn't been rearranged. Halfway through the night, the room tightened the way it had on my first encounter, that subtle rearranging of space. Dominic entered without drama, no entourage making noise, just two men who blended into the walls. He chose a table where he could see the whole floor, and the staff reacted before my mind did. Even the owner appeared this time, smiling too wide, bowing with his posture. Dominic's attention found me once, brief and steady, less possession than confirmation. He was inside my world now, and everyone could tell. I should have felt safer, knowing he was near, but the street outside the windows kept pulling at my instincts. When I carried a tray past the front glass, I caught two men across the way, standing too still for tourists, too plain for businessmen. They watched the entrance, not the menu board, not the passing couples. One lifted his phone, and the screen flashed as if he'd taken a picture. Paulo shifted instantly, a half step closer, his gaze sharpening. Those men were not his. They didn't move like protection. They moved like curiosity with teeth. I finished the shift on autopilot, heart thudding every time the door opened. In the kitchen, my hands stayed steady, but my thoughts sprinted. If Knox was testing my perimeter, then Luce was a spotlight, and I was standing in the beam. When the driver pulled up after closing, I saw the watchers disappear into traffic like they'd never existed. Dominic didn't approach me, but I felt his awareness like a hand at my back. In the car ride home, Brooklyn's lights looked softer through tinted glass, and the apartment's quiet waited for us. I tucked Ellie into her new bed and listened to the building's silence, realizing the cage wasn't just the locks. It was the countdown outside, and I knew Dominic would tell me to quit, and I didn't know how to choose between being safe and being myself. I woke up in the Brooklyn Heights apartment, and my first thought was not the view. It was the two men across the street, the way they had stood too still outside Roma. Even in daylight, my nerves kept replaying their empty faces like a warning label. Ellie padded into the kitchen in socks, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and I forced my voice to sound normal. I made oatmeal, packed her lunchbox, and watched the camera above the hallway door blink once, twice. Safety had a rhythm here, and it never let me forget who paid for it. Dominic had not ordered me to quit, but the message had been clear in his quiet, controlled way. The restaurant was a stage, and stages made easy targets. He wanted me at the foundation instead, behind locked doors and curated light, where enemies could not reach me without crossing lines. Part of me wanted to take that offer and breathe again. Another part clung to Luce the way Ellie clung to my hand in crowds, because it was mine, because I had chosen it. If I let fear decide, what was I teaching my daughter about the world? That you shrink until you disappear, and call it wisdom. I could not live that lesson, even with cameras watching. Grandma June tried to lighten the mood, joking about how rich people buildings always smelled like someone had just apologized. She made Ellie laugh, then pulled me aside with the kind of tenderness that still felt like armor. Her eyes told me she would back my choice, but she would not bury her granddaughter for my pride. I nodded, because she was right, and because being right did not make it easier. After June left for the afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It pretended to be a wrong message, but it mentioned Ellie by name and described the blue backpack she wore to school. My stomach dropped so fast I had to sit on the couch. No threat, no demand, just the sick reminder that someone could see us. I deleted it, then felt stupid, because you cannot delete a person who is watching. Paulo checked the lobby footage when I asked, and his face tightened in a way that confirmed my fear without words. The next day I tried to reclaim normal by walking Ellie to a nearby coffee shop after school. Sunlight spilled on the sidewalk, and tourists took pictures of the river, and I kept scanning reflections like they were mirrors to another life. A black sedan sat at the curb 2 blocks away, the same one I had noticed twice near Luce. When we turned a corner, it rolled forward, slow and patient. I told myself it was coincidence until the driver lifted his head and held eye contact through the windshield. My skin prickled, and Ellie squeezed my fingers, asking why my hand was cold. That was when the truth snapped into focus. Knox was not only circling Dominic's empire, he was circling me, because I was softer than steel and easier to move. My job, my routines, my stubborn need to feel ordinary, all of it was a map to my daughter. Independence, I realized, could be a gift to Ellie, or it could be a handle for someone else to grab. That night I stood at my bedroom window and thought about the foundation offer again. Art felt like oxygen, and Dominic had placed it within reach. But I feared the strings tied to his hand. I feared becoming an ornament in a life too polished to be mine. Yet I feared more the idea of Ellie learning to flinch at every stranger the way I did. I could hear Dominic's logic in my head, calm and relentless, and for once it sounded less like control and more like a lifeline. In the morning, I decided to run a small errand with Ellie, just to prove I still could. We stepped into the lobby, and the air felt wrong, like a room after a door shuts. Before my mind could explain it, my body reacted, heartbeat jumping, vision narrowing, the old instinct screaming that eyes were on us again. Ellie tugged my sleeve and pointed at the doorman, asking if he was new, and I forced a smile while my eyes searched the glass doors. Outside, the sidewalk looked ordinary. Dog walkers, a stroller, a delivery guy balancing boxes. Then I caught the reflection of the black sedan in the lobby mirror, idling across the street, engine running, as if it had been waiting for our elevator. Paulo was not beside the mailboxes today. The suited man who usually pretended to scroll was gone. In his place stood a stranger with a coffee cup, watching the entrance without blinking. I felt my lungs lock. I guided Ellie toward the door anyway, because stopping felt worse. The moment the cold air hit my face, the stranger's gaze pinned us, and I knew the debate was over right now today. Ellie's mittened hand was warm in mine as we stepped out of the lobby into a bright Brooklyn morning. She was talking about a sticker on her lunchbox, and I was trying to match her lightness, letting the paper cup of coffee heat my fingers like a tiny anchor. The sidewalk was busy with dog walkers and delivery carts, and the ordinary noise almost convinced me. Almost. The prickling at the back of my neck hit first, sharp as a pin. I glanced toward the street and saw the sin-black sedan idling across the way, engine running, driver hidden by tint. Near the entrance stood a man with a coffee cup, too still, watching the doors instead of the world. When his gaze met mine and didn't flinch, my stomach dropped. My body shifted Ellie closer, and I angled us toward the corner like we'd simply changed our minds. Paulo materialized at my shoulder with a calm that felt practiced. He didn't make a scene. He closed distance, matched my pace, and guided us down a side street with the kind of control that turns panic into motion. I kept my face soft for Ellie, smoothing her hair, nodding along as if nothing was wrong, while my pulse tried to climb out of my throat. Behind us, footsteps followed with unhurried patience, and the sedan rolled forward, tracking the turn. We reached a dark SUV parked where it could swallow us fast. The rear door opened before we touched it. I climbed in first, pulling Ellie onto my lap, and Paulo slid in after, already speaking into his earpiece in clipped bursts. The driver eased away from the curb, smooth and immediate. In the side mirror, the sedan turned the same way we turned, closing the gap like it had rehearsed. The city blurred into a grid of choices. The driver threaded between a delivery van and a cab, then cut left, then right, making turns that felt too tight for comfort. Horns snapped. A cyclist shouted something I didn't catch. Ellie's small hands fisted my coat, and I held her steady, breathing slow so she could borrow my rhythm. I kept my eyes on windows and mirrors, watching the sedan stay present without rushing, as if it wanted me to notice it. That was worse than speed. Speed could be desperation. This was intention. A cold understanding slid in while my fear tried to drown it. If Knox's men wanted to grab me, they could have rushed the lobby, shoved us into a van, ended the story in silence. Instead, they were chasing in daylight, loud enough to rattle me, controlled enough to keep me alive. They were trying to scare me into a decision, to make me blame Dominic for every risk, to make me beg for a deal, to make me offer something information. Access. A moment of weakness just to stop feeling hunted. They weren't only after my body. They were after my loyalty, using Ellie's safety as the blade. Paulo signaled the driver, and we cut onto a narrower street where parked cars squeezed the lanes. The sedan followed, but its confidence faltered as two black SUVs slid into view ahead, perfectly placed, blocking the road like a wall that had grown out of asphalt. The sedan hesitated. In a quick flash of peripheral vision, I saw doors open, figures moving with decisive speed, the scene turning into a trap behind us. Paulo didn't let me twist around to watch. He kept one hand braced on the seat and his attention on distance, as if his job was to keep my eyes forward and my heart from shattering. After the intercept, the pressure didn't vanish immediately. The driver kept moving, taking a route that felt boring, as if normal streets could erase what had happened. We crossed an avenue where schoolkids waited with backpacks, and the sight nearly broke me. I held Ellie's head against my shoulder and whispered nonsense to keep her calm, counting her breaths the way I used to when she had fevers. Paulo kept scanning mirrors, then the dashboard screen, coordinating with someone I never saw. Every time we stopped at a light, my muscles clenched, expecting the sedan to reappear. It didn't, but the absence felt like a pause, not surrender. When the skyline thinned and trees began to crowd the road, my hands finally stopped shaking enough to feel coffee spill dried on my sleeve. We didn't stop until the city gave way to trees and long drives. 20 minutes later, iron gates rose in front of us at Dominic's Hudson Valley estate, cameras tracking the car as it entered. The quiet inside the property felt unreal after the noise, like someone had turned the volume down on the world. When we parked, my legs shook as I climbed out, Ellie still pressed to my side. Dominic was already on the steps, face hard and controlled, the kind of fury that doesn't need shouting. Paulo delivered his report in fragments, and with each one Dominic's jaw tightened, like a lock clicking into place. I couldn't hear his exact words, but I felt the meaning hit. Carter Knox had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and as Dominic stepped closer, calm wrapped around something final, I realized the next day wouldn't be about hiding. It would be about consequences. By the time the gates closed behind us, my hands were still shaking, even though Ellie was safe against my side and the air smelled like wet leaves instead of exhaust. The house looked calm, almost gentle, but my body refused to believe it. Dominic waited on the stone steps, suit perfect, eyes dark with something quieter than rage. It was the kind of calm that meant decisions were already moving. Paulo spoke low and fast, and I watched Dominic's jaw tighten, like a lock turning. I realized I had been rescued into another storm, and I couldn't outrun it. Inside, someone whisked Ellie away to a guest room with warm blankets and a cartoon already paused on the screen. She kept looking back at me, confused but trusting, and that trust felt heavier than any threat. Grandma June arrived soon after, hair windblown, face set, wrapping Ellie in arms that smelled like lavender and determination. I stood in the hallway listening to my own heartbeat, trying to swallow the panic. Dominic moved through the space like he owned silence itself. Whatever Knox wanted today, Dominic intended to end it tomorrow. I felt that promise like steel beneath my ribs. I had spent years surviving men who used anger as a shortcut, and I knew the difference between noise and power. Dominic didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. A phone call from him could change someone's whole life, and that truth scared me more than the chase. If I accepted his protection, I was accepting the reality that he could turn the world sharp. But if I refused, I was asking Ellie to keep walking past shadows with nothing but my stubbornness. Safety was no longer an idea. It was a decision, and I had to choose it. When Dominic finally looked at me, it felt like standing under a spotlight that could either warm or burn. I didn't want to be rescued. I wanted to be seen as a mother who had done her best with bad options. I stepped closer, not because fear pushed me, but because love for my daughter did. I let myself imagine Ellie growing up without flinching at doorbells. I told myself I was done bargaining with terror. If Dominic's world was where safety lived, I would enter it on my feet. I would stay whole, even if the world split me. The words I carried for years came out steady. I needed truth between us. No half answers, no convenient silence. Ellie had to come first, always, not as a bargaining chip but as my heart walking outside my body. My work had to be mine, too, because I could not trade my identity for comfort. I would take the foundation role, but only as a path I chose, with training, real responsibilities, and a name that belonged to me. Dominic could protect, but I would decide, every day, whether I stayed. If he wanted me, he must meet me halfway. I expected resistance, a subtle punishment dressed as patience. Instead, Dominic listened like my terms mattered. I saw it in the stillness of his shoulders, in the way his eyes softened without losing their edge. He gave a small nod, the kind that made grown men move faster, and I understood the twist of it. He was agreeing, not pretending, not negotiating me down, but accepting the rules I set. The power in that moment shifted. He wasn't claiming me as property. He was inviting me to stand beside him, and that felt almost frighteningly fair. I exhaled for once. My knees went weak with the release of being heard. Dominic stepped close enough that I could feel warmth through fabric, close enough that the rest of the room blurred. He touched my cheek with a gentleness that didn't erase the past but acknowledged it. I leaned in, and the kiss that followed was brief, steady, and full of promise. It tasted like coffee and relief, and something I couldn't name yet. When we parted, my forehead rested near his, and I felt the strange comfort of matching breaths, as if my nervous system finally found a rhythm it trusted. After that, time moved in quiet edits. I didn't see Dominic make calls, and I didn't ask for details. But the atmosphere changed the way weather changes after a storm passes. Paulo's shoulders loosened. The same black sedan stopped appearing near our building. My phone stayed silent except for normal things. School reminders, June's grocery lists, Ryan's cautious updates. I still looked over my shoulder, but I stopped expecting footsteps every time. The city returned to its chaos, and for the first time in weeks it felt like background noise instead of a warning. Knox's shadow didn't vanish, just retreated. Ryan kept his head down and his hands busy, showing up early, leaving late, earning trust back the slow way. He stopped trying to talk his way into forgiveness and started living like someone who meant it. June watched him hard, then softened enough to send him home with leftovers, because guilt was not a diet. Ellie began sleeping through the night in her new room, nightlight glowing, rabbit tucked under her arm. I stood in her doorway and listened to her breathing, stunned by the quiet. Fear still visited, but it no longer owned the whole day for us. The foundation office smelled like paper and polished wood, not garlic and wine. On my first day, I touched catalog pages and felt an old part of me wake up. I logged shipments, organized notes for an upcoming exhibit, and listened like my life depended on learning. Dominic didn't hover. He let the work be mine. When I came home, Ellie asked what I did, and I told her I helped take care of beautiful things. Her eyes lit up. Purpose, I realized, is another kind of safety. It gives you a spine when fear tries to fold you again. Looking back, the difference between a cage and a choice was never the locks. It was consent. In my old life, fear decided everything and called it love. In Dominic's world, fear existed too. But I had a voice, and my voice had weight. I didn't pretend the darkness was romantic. I simply faced it with boundaries. Real safety should not require you to shrink. It should make room for you to grow, to protect your child without losing yourself. I still carried fear, but I carried it like a tool, not a chain, and I stopped asking to exist. If you've ever lived braced for the next bad moment, I hope my story reminds you that you can choose a different ending, not a perfect one, just a chosen one. Mine began when I stopped hiding and started naming my needs. I still don't pretend the world is safe. Dominic carries history I haven't fully touched, and power attracts new enemies. But now I meet danger with open eyes, because Ellie is watching and I finally believe I deserve more than survival. If this hit your heart, please like, share, and comment your choice. There's always a next test.